Hi folks, it's Mr. Weston here, and this is the Final Fantasy Trading Card Game Complete Opus 1 review. Now this is part 2. We are taking a look at the ice cards that you get for Opus 1. If you do want to check out the fire, or at least how all the videos will go, please check out my first one, which is the fire cards that you get. So to start off, we are going to take a look at Chemist. So of course, when Chemist enters the field, choose one forward and you dull it. So essentially, if your opponent has got a few forwards out there, if Chemist does enter the field as a backup, just dull it straight away. Not too bad. Next up we have, now that's the female Chemist, we're looking at the male Chemist. So of course when he enters the field, you choose one forward and it cannot be broken this turn. So normally cards can be broken, so aka put it straight into the break zone. This card will allow the card to not break at all. Next up we have Argith from Final Fantasy Tactics. So of course when he does enter the field, your opponent discards one card from his or her hand. It's enough to pretty much minimize the amount of cards your opponent does play, so that's not too bad. There we go. Next up, we have Oren from Final Fantasy Tactics. So of course, when his ability activates, it's a nice backup too, dull all the forwards your opponent controls. So essentially this means here, and it is a pretty high cost to do it, but it's not too bad. So you've got to discard a copy of it, pay 3 ice, and pretty much, discard a copy of it, sorry, pretty much pay 3 ice and dull it. So you tell that to dull all your opponent's forwards. So essentially, they can't block. Next up, we have Bard. Now, I'm not 100% sure on the names of the characters from Final Fantasy 3. I wish I knew them off the top of my head, but I sadly don't. But this is version 1 of Bard. So, of course, you can pay 2 ice, dull this card, and you could choose one forward and dull it. So there you go. Again, dulling means that your opponent cannot block a certain card. Cannot block forwards, sorry. Next up, we have Bard number 2. So this is a backup version rather than the forward version. So of course, when this Bard enters goes into the break zone, you pay ice, dull it, you put this card into the break zone, your opponent discards one card from his or her hand. So this is essentially like Argith, only this time it's a backup one. Next up, we have Kuja from Dissidia Final Fantasy. So if your opponent does decide to target Kuja for a summon or an ability, your opponent discards one card from his or her hand. This is enough. This should be enough for Kuja to survive, however. Especially, although if you are playing Bahamut, goodbye Kuja. Of course, Brynhilda and Ifrit, he can survive it. So that's not too bad. And speaking of summons, next up we have Shiva with Snow on top of her. Silly me. Essentially, this is a nice EX burst you have here. So if you can choose one full, dull it and freeze it. So essentially, dulling it, and the following term, it cannot dull, cannot be undulled. So. Brought back. So say if I was to have Argith on the field and this card comes out, it dulls. When my turn comes back, I cannot use Argith again until the following turn. So there you go. Now going back to Shiva, we are going to bring out Shiva from Final Fantasy Tactics. So if you manage to summon that version of Shiva, you can pretty much do this one as well. So you can choose one dull forward and deal 5,000 damage. Technically, that should work for frozen ones as well, but there you go. So if you manage to dull Argith and you summon this one, Argith is gone. There we go. Next up, we have Summoner from Final Fantasy Tactics. This is pretty much just another standard unit you've got here, so as a backup, probably not your best bet. If you are starting out, possibly, but otherwise, I would replace this for another card instead. Next up, we have Squall from Final Fantasy VIII. So this one, when this one blocks or is blocked, you can choose a forward and deal it 6,000 damage, which is not too bad. This is enough to take out a majority of the fire cards that I showed off earlier. And of course, you do have the ability Renzoku Ken. So of course, Squall gains first strike until the end of turn. So you're discarding a copy of Squall and dulling, and pretty much paying a ice element. There we go. Which is not a bad ability, especially when Squall is blocking. So you can pretty much have Squall do the damage first while blocking and deal another 6,000 damage to your opponent. Next up, we have Squall from Final Fantasy VII. Sorry, there we go, bring that into focus. So if you're lucky enough to have a card named Laguna, if you control Laguna, Squall gains 3,000 power. So at a full cost and eventually 9,000 power, that's not too bad. So of course, when he does enter the field, each player discards one card from their hand. There you go. And if of course you control Laguna, your opponent discards one more card from his or her hand. So you discard one, and your opponent discards two. So essentially, if they're drawing two each turn, you're discarding their draw, so to speak. Next up, we have Snow from Final Fantasy XIII. Yeah, I can't see the irony of it being an ice element, and of course his name being Snow. So of course, when Snow attacks, you choose one forward your opponent controls and you dull it. Now, of course, if you summoned any copy of the Shivas that I just shown before, you can also freeze it as well. So when he attacks, you can pretty much dull a forward if your opponent only has one forward. There you go, you got yourself a free damage. Next up, we have Sephiroth. Now, this is the ice version of Sephiroth rather than the one I'm going to be showing off later. This one does have first strike, so he will do damage first. And of course, when he does enter the field, each player discards two cards from his or her hand. Not too bad. I'm not 100% sure if I do want to discard cards though, and I'm not actually playing ice, so there you go, that's that one. Now you can't have Snow without Sarah from Final Fantasy XIII. Now of course, if you do control a copy of Snow, it cannot be chosen your opponent's abilities. Summons will still affect it, but not opponent's abilities. So say if you were to have Squall out, that's his ability. You choose one forward, deal 6,000, Snow cannot be affected. So there's that. Next up, we have, bring this out, Terra from Dissidia Final Fantasy. So this is her Dissidia Final Fantasy artwork rather than her Final Fantasy VI artwork. So of course the cost required for your opponent to cast summons increases by 1. Now we've just shown off Shiva from both Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy Tactics. There were 3 and 1 respectively. That will now be 4 and 2. Doesn't matter too bad for the 1 cost Shiva, considering all you need to do is discard a card to summon it. But of course, speaking of summons, Terra cannot be chosen by your opponent's summons. Say if you were to have Brynhilda, you cannot target Terra. Get to that. And of course, she can activate Trance as well, so you can discard a copy of Terra and pay 2 ice. Until the end of turn, Terra gains 3,000 power and first strike. 9,000 power, first strike. Not a bad trade-off, I think. And we have ourselves another copy of Terra from Final Fantasy, Dissidia Final Fantasy. More artwork from that. So, of course, when Terra enters the field, choose up to 2 dull forwards your opponent controls. So, essentially, if your opponent decides to attack and you bring Terra out, you deal them 4,000 damage. Of course, you can pay ice to deal 1,000 damage to another dull forward. And Magic Charge, you pretty much activate an ability. If Terra deals damage to a forward, double the damage until the end of turn. So essentially this is Garland as an ice element. So, actually no it's not. It's probably something else. But either way, rather than deal 7,000, you deal 14,000. Next up we have Devout from Final Fantasy III. So of course, what you pretty much do is you dull it. You put this card into the break zone, choose one forward that costs 4 or less from the break zone, and play it onto the field. You can only use it during your turn. So say if Terra was in my break zone, I can bring this one back. I can bring her back thanks to this card. Next up, we have Time Mage. Now, I've seen a couple of players actually use Time Mage quite effectively. So pretty much you pay a ice and dull this card. You choose a forward, and it cannot attack the turn that it's pretty much it just can't attack at all. It could block the following turn, but it can't attack. So if you only have if your opponent only has one forward on the field and it tries to attack, activate Time Mage. Now, next up, we have Knight from Final Fantasy Tactics. This is pretty much a 3-cost, 7,000 power card. And again, it's just a standard unit. But again, I will get into how this card can be useful a bit later on. Potentially. Oop. Didn't want to knock that. Next up, we have Nuge from Final Fantasy X. I don't remember seeing this character, but then again, I haven't been playing 10 for long. So, of course, when he does enter the field, your opponent discards one card from his or her hand. When he leaves the field, your opponent can draw a card. In essence, this is actually a win-win rather than a win-lose. So you can pretty much make your opponent draw cards rather than have them, well, not 100% sure of how to word it, but you can deck out your opponent a little bit quicker by playing this card. Possibly. Next up, we have Hades. Now, this is the Final Fantasy VII version of Hades. So, of course, you choose a forward and you back up your opponent has. You dull the forward and you turn it back up to your opponent's hand. So, essentially, if I was to have Knight and Time Mage out, that's another 5 costs that they got to have to bring them back. And your opponent also discards a card from their hand. That's actually quite nice. Next up, we have Summoner from Final Fantasy III, rather than from Final Fantasy Tactics. This one's a little bit more useful than the Summoner from Final Fantasy Tactics. So you pretty much pay a ice cost, put Summoner into the break zone, choose one summon, and you cancel its effect. So say if your opponent was to have Shiva, you pay the cost, you can pretty much cancel its effect and put this one into the break zone. So that's actually not too bad. Next up, we have Dark Knight from Final Fantasy III. Now, this is one version of Dark Knight. So you pay 2 ice cost, and you can deal 1,000 damage to all your forwards your opponent controls. It's not too bad. That does mean you do a little bit of damage beforehand. That can be enough for them to not attack you. To not block back. So that's not too bad. Next up, we have another Dark Knight from Final Fantasy III. So essentially, this one might be a little bit trickier to use. Because, of course, the effect here is, if this Dark Knight is put from the field into the break zone, Dark Knight deals you 1 point of damage. So this is a double-edged sword here. While it is 8,000 power and costs 3, there can be probably better cards that could do it, but if you have Dark Knight, that's not too bad. Next up, we have Joseph from Final Fantasy II. So, of course, Joseph does have Brave, meaning when he does attack, he cannot be dulled with the turn that he attacks. If you pretty much dull this card, however, you put him into the break zone, choose one blocking forward, it cannot be broken. So, say if I was to block with Nuge, he cannot be broken. So he will still do 7,000 damage. Your opponent can do 7,000 damage to him, but he won't be broken. Next up, we have Duke Larg from Final Fantasy Tactics. This is pretty much the same card as Liberu. I think that's how you pronounce it, from the previous video. All the ice forwards you control gain 1,000 power. So all the forwards that you see here that I've shown off will gain 1,000 power. Next up, and going back to Squall, we now have Laguna from Final Fantasy VIII. So, of course, when Laguna deals damage to your opponent, you choose one dull forward that your opponent has. You may deal it 7,000 damage. So, essentially, if your opponent has a few dull forwards, you can deal this one 7,000 damage. And of course, you do have Desperado. you choose another dial forward and you deal 9,000 damage. Of course, you do need to discard a copy of Laguna and pay 2 ice. And we can't have enough Laguna, so we're going to bring out the Dissidia Final Fantasy Laguna. So of course, when this is another EX burst, when Laguna enters the field, choose one forward your opponent controls and you dull it. And if you have Squall on the field, you can freeze the forward also. And if you control card named Squall, this one gains 7,000, another 2,000 power. So 9,000 power, 4 cost if you have Squall on the field. So the Dissidia Final Fantasy Squall and Dissidia Final Fantasy Laguna is probably a nice match, and I've seen that happen a few times before. And finally, we have Leon from Final Fantasy II. So when Leon enters the field, your opponent may play one character card from his or her hand onto the field. So essentially, 3 cost, 9,000 power, and your opponent brings out a card from their hand onto the field. I've not seen many people use Leon yet, so that can hopefully work in some cases, but either way. So there you have it. These are pretty much all the ice cards that you have so far from the Opus 1 collection. And what a nice collection it is. There we go. So the next one we'll bring out will be from, and I think that's it, Wind, that's it. We're going to show off all the Wind cards next, so this is Mr. Wesson. I will see you guys next time. Bye!